I think Obsession and Backroom accidentally exposed one of Hollywood's biggest problems. And the funny thing is, I don't think they did it on purpose. Because if you look at these two movies, they are completely different films, different stories, different styles, and different audiences. But both of them ended up proving the exact same thing. But still, people still show up for original movies. And honestly, that's a conversation worth having. Because for the last few years, every time an original movie underperformed, we kept hearing the same explanation. Audiences only want franchisee, they only want sequels, and they only care about big spectacles. But then movies like Obsession and Backroom came along, and suddenly that argument starts falling apart. And before somebody says, well, that's because they are low budget films, I don't buy that. Because the low budget movies fail all the time, every single year. Most of them disappear without anybody even noticing them. So, being a low budget is not the reason. The question is, why did people notice these two films? And I think the answer is surprisingly simple. They gave people something to talk about. Take Obsession. Nobody walked into that movie thinking it was going to be one of the biggest success stories of the year. There were no expectations, no giant franchise attached to it, no cinematic universe, no 20-year legacy carrying it. It was just a movie trying to stand on its own feet. और शायद वही उसकी सबसे बड़ी strength थी. Because the film had to earn people's attention. It couldn't rely on nostalgia. It couldn't rely on any brand recognition. It had to rely on the movie itself. और जब ऐसा होता है, suddenly story becomes important again. Filmmaking and execution becomes important again. And then there's Backrooms. Honestly, if somebody pitched me that idea 5 years ago, I would have said there's no way a major audience is going to show up for that. An internet horror concept? That's the movie? Seriously? But that's exactly why it worked. Because it felt different. The moment you saw it, you know it wasn't trying to be next version of something they have already watched 10 times. It had its own identity, the movie had its own atmosphere and its own weirdness. और audience को वही weirdness पसंद आई. Because people are actually hungry for something new. Not necessarily something bigger, not necessarily, louder. Just different. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like that's where Hollywood gets confused sometimes. Because every time a movie fails, the discussion immediately becomes about budget, marketing, CGI, box office projections. But very rarely do we ask a much simpler question. Was the movie interesting? Because audiences don't hate CGI. They don't hate franchises. They don't even hate blockbusters. अगर मूवी अच्छी हो, लोग आज भी थिएटर्स जाते हैं. We've seen that happen again and again. There are so many examples. There are so many movies. I think audiences are just getting tired of movies that feels like manufactured. Movies that feels like, products first and stories second. That's where Obsession and Backrooms stand out. When people talk about these movies, they're not talking about how expensive they were. They're talking about scenes, ideas, moments, the atmosphere they felt in the movie, the experience they had. That's a huge difference. Because nobody recommends a movie by saying, bro, the budget was amazing. Nobody says that. They say, bro, you need to watch this. And that's exactly what happened here. Word of mouth took over. People started talking about it. People got curious. And the audience basically did the marketing themselves. Which brings me to what I think is the biggest lesson from all this. A great movie doesn't need every advantage in the world. It doesn't need a $1 billion brand. It doesn't need 10 spin offs. It doesn't need a shared universe. Sometimes, it just needs a filmmaker with a clear vision and a story worth telling. And that's exactly what we are seeing here. If you look at Obsession, one of the most fascinating thing about its success is who made it. Curry Baker. Curry Baker wasn't some established Hollywood director with decades of studio experience. He came from YouTube. Or honestly, that's kind of amazing when you think about it. He spent years making videos, experimenting with storytelling, figure out what works and what doesn't. And somehow the journey eventually led to a feature film that audiences genuinely connected with. Backroom tells a similar story as well. The entire concept started online. It grew through internet culture, curiosity, and people became obsessed with the idea because it felt unique. और शायद इसी वजह से उनकी फिल्म इतनी अलग फील होती है. These films weren't created inside a boardroom trying to figure out the next trend. They started with creators who genuinely believed in an idea. And that's the difference. Because when filmmakers are trying to chase audiences, they're usually already behind. लेकिन जब फिल्ममेकर्स किसी एक आइडिया को जेन्युइनली एक्सप्लोर करना चाहता है, ऑडियंसेस उस एफर्ट को नोटिस करती हैं. एंड मे बी दैट्स द लेसन. नॉट एवरी सक्सेसफुल मूवी नीड्स टू स्टार्ट विद अ मैसिव बजट. Sometimes it starts with a person who simply has a story they desperately want to tell. और जब विजन क्लियर हो, ऑडियंस तक वो बात पहुंची जाती है. And maybe that's why these movies worked. Not because they were small, not because they were independent, but because they remembered something that a lot of bigger movies sometimes forget. Before a movie needs to be a franchisee, before it needs to be a brand, it needs to be a good movie. And that's a lesson Hollywood should never have needed to relearn in the first place. Thank you for watching.